Miss Fear here. Welcome back to today's Donkey Storytime. Happy Monday, happy start of a new week. Today we also have not only a start of a new week, but a start of a new story too. We are going to dive on into a classic and one of my favorites actually from when I was a kid too. I remember hearing this story the first time and totally diving into all the imaginative adventures that happen. So hold on, buckle up for this one because there's going to be a lot of twists and turns in this story. This is James and the Giant Peach, and this is written by Roald Dahl. All right, let's dive on in, and we shall begin. Chapter 1. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was the sandy beach for him to run about on and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect life for a small boy. Team Beach, just like many of us. I know a lot of you love the beach too. This would be the perfect place to be. Then, there's always a twist in Roald Dahl's books. Then, one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up, in full daylight, mind you, on a crowded street by an enormous angry rhinoceros which had escaped from the London Zoo. Unexpected. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. Oh, poor James. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Doesn't sound terribly bad, right? Unfortunate thing happened, but now he's going off to live with his aunts. Should be a good thing, but it never is in these stories. Poor little James. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I am sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started treating poor James terribly for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as, "You disgusting little beast," or "You filthy nuisance," or "You miserable creature." Not the nicest nicknames. And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a ramshackle house on the top of a high hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden, James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or a picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out into the garden," Aunt Spiker had said. And sorry, Marla. You got something? You got an itch? Okay, he's back. He's got some allergies today. Little sniffle? Okay, we're ready. And the terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole top of the hill, was large and desolate, pretty empty. And the only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that actually never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sand pit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company. And as time went on, he became sadder and more lonely. And he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at that lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that spread out below him like a magic carpet. Now, not the most positive and uplifting first chapter of any story, certainly a different tone from our last book, but remember, authors do this on purpose. There is plenty of adventure, plenty of wild and crazy things to come, but first, they really need to get us thinking about James Henry Trotter, and right now, really feeling bad for him. He needs something to change here. Not to worry. Things always turn out better in these books, but we'll continue on to chapter 2. I'll read you a few because the chapters are pretty short in this one to start. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then the very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. Something kind of strange turns into something pretty unexpected. Turns into something downright wild and crazy. It's coming. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for a moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. Now I'll pause there. Not the nicest way to describe someone, but again, remember, the author's trying to set the stage for us here. James, good, Aunt's bad. So he's going to use not very nice adjectives to describe them too. We'll continue. She had small picky eyes, a sunken mouth, and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, those 2 ghostly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror in her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. I look and smell, Aunt Sponge declared, as lovely as a rose. Do you agree, Milo? I don't think he buys it. Just feast your eyes upon my face, observe my shapely nose, behold my heavenly silky locks, and if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget, Aunt Spiker cried, how much your tummy shows. That's not very nice. Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, my sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the pimple on my chin. My dear old trout, Aunt Sponge cried out, you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood, Aunt Sponge declared. Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts. They'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign. I think you'd make, Aunt Spiker said, a lovely Frankenstein. Not only are they evil to themselves, but evil to each other too. Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wildflowers, and all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began to ooze out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely. "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Off you go," cried Aunt Sponge. "I am upset," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I am upset with you, and I will continue to be upset later in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now, get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind the clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. Not to worry, we'll continue. Chapter 3. It was at this point that first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many other much more peculiar things, happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling in the leaves and turned around and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. Must be something about those dark green suits. Didn't our character from the last story also have the velvet green suit and his mushroom cap? So funny. All right, so anyway, we have another man, maybe not quite as friendly, but we have another man in a green suit just popping in. He turned around and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, and he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said, beckoning to James with a finger. "Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful." Good idea or bad idea? If this wasn't a fictional story, a terrible idea. That definitely sounds like stranger danger, but because it's a fictional story, of course we'll go see what the man has. Of course! Let's go find out, Milo. James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then put his hand into his pocket of his jacket and took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. "You know what this is, my dear? You know what's inside this little bag?" Then he came nearer still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel breath blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like the air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag and tilting it toward James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals. Make sure you've got a mental image of this. White paper bag, little stones or crystals. Each one about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming from inside it. And then he noticed that all the thousands of tiny little green things were moving very, very slowly, stirring about and moving over each other as though they were alive. There's more power and magic in these things in there than in all the rest of the world put together, the old man said softly. But, what are they? James murmured, finding his voice at last. Where do they come from? Aha, the old man whispered. You'd never guess that. He was crouching a little now and pushing his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his very long nose was actually touching the skin on James's forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. Crocodile tongues, he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights with the eyeballs of a lizard and the fingers of a young monkey and the gizzard of a pig and the beak of a green parrot, the juice of a porcupine and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week and then let the moon do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper bag into James's hands and said, Here, take it, it's yours. Chapter 4. This will be our last chapter for today. James Henry Trotter stood there, clutching the bag and staring at the old man. And now, the old man said, all you've got to do is this. Take a large jug of water, pour all the little green things into it. Then very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your very own head. That sets them off. It gets them going. In a couple of minutes, the water will soon begin to froth and bubble furiously. And as soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful in one gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start coming out of your mouth. And immediately after that, marvelous things will be happening to you. Fabulous, unbelievable things. And you will never be miserable again in your life, because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now off you go and do exactly as I say, and don't whisper a word of this to those 2 terrible aunts of yours. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either, because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon someone else instead of upon you. And that isn't what you want at all, my dear, is it? Whoever they meet first, be it bug, insect, animal, or tree, that will be the only one who gets the full power of their magic. So hold that bag tight. Don't tear up the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time. Hurry. With that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. Quite an unexpected start. I told you this story would be full of lots of twists and turns and imaginative adventures. We started off really getting to know the characters. We know James, good, aunt, bad, green man, or man in the green suit, we're not sure yet. Unexpected for sure. We'll see what happens if James is able to follow these directions, or even if he wants to. I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll find out more the next time. And each time I'll read you a few chapters just as I did today. For now, I will leave you with that. I'll let your minds continue with your own imagination and thoughts about what might happen next. And I'll remind you just to continue checking the Google Classroom as we go through our week. We've got our new choices on our choice board. We have a bingo meet coming up on Tuesday. And then we also have some reading groups we're going to be doing it on Wednesday as well. And of course, a fun meet on Thursday. I'll keep you up to date on all of those in our Google Classroom. In the meantime, don't forget to look for moments where you can show caring and kindness to one another. Keep up the great work, my friends, and I'll see you all soon. Bye, guys.